Yeah, Easter really is all about the hope of new life. And if you've been with us, you know we've been talking all during Lent about what's wrong with us, what's wrong with our world. On Easter morning, we're going to talk about how Jesus' resurrection makes everything that's wrong about our world right. So, hope you'll join us for that. Maybe there's a friend of yours, a neighbor, somebody that you care about and love that you can invite as well. We'd love to have you do that as well. Well, throughout these last few weeks, we have been looking at the minor prophets and asking the question, what's wrong? What's wrong with us? What's wrong with our world? And last week, if you were here, a good friend of mine, Sean Sycamore, stepped on many of our toes as he talked about injustice, the problem with injustice. And we've talked in previous weeks about the problem of violence and racism and a lot of other ugly truths that we are forced sooner or later to have to face about our lives. Some of them tend to be societal kinds of sins with sometimes political implications. But the thing that I want us to look at today that's wrong with us is something of a different sort. First of all, it doesn't always look like something wrong within us. In fact, sometimes it looks fine, even feels good. And it's something that's more personal, not quite as much a societal sort of a thing. But we want to look at the whole problem of materialism, and we're going to look at a book that will talk about that a great deal. And that book is the book by the name of Haggai. So we're going to be looking at this. I notice I said the word Haggai. I didn't say Hagrid. That's another guy. But, you know, when I read some of these minor prophets, I have a pretty good sense that he might have looked a bit, these minor prophets, a little bit like that burly fellow there. But it's Haggai or Haggai. All of those are proper and acceptable pronunciations. Or, again, you can just use Harry if that works for you. But one of the things that I appreciate about the book is how succinct it is, and maybe you'll appreciate that as well. It's really one of the shortest books in the whole Bible, just 2 chapters. And so we're going to just jump right in as it begins with verse 1 of chapter 1. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. And this is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Now, there's a whole lot of names and dates here in this first opening verse. So, as we often need to do to understand what's going on, we probably need a little orientation. So, if you've been with us, you'll remember that these minor prophets are ministering over a number of, really a couple hundred years during what we call the divided kingdom. And you can see that that happened after David and Solomon. And as a result of that, split into the north and south. The northern kingdom, called Israel, ended up falling to the invading nation of Assyria in the year 722-21. And those northern 10 tribes were pretty much assimilated into Assyrian culture. And that's why we sometimes refer to these tribes as the 10 lost tribes. They just kind of disappear in terms of identity in the world. About 150 years after that, the southern tribe of Judah fell to not the Assyrians, but to another empire called the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians, they had a different foreign policy toward conquered people. They didn't assimilate them. They actually took them en masse and relocated the people so that they would be totally immersed in the Babylonian culture. And that's what they did to these Jewish folks. After the fall of Jerusalem, the vast majority of these Judeans were transported, marched hundreds of miles eastward to the land of Babylon, where they spent the next 70 years. Now, this was both a tragedy and a great humiliation to the people of God. They had lost their promised land. They had lost their beloved holy city. And most impactfully, they had lost their temple that had been burned to the ground by the Babylonians, that place where they had offered sacrifices and where they had celebrated as a people all the ways that God had been at work in their lives throughout the years. It was during the time when they were in Babylon, by the way, that you had three major prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, who continued to minister to the people while they were in Babylon in exile. Now, eventually, those Babylonians, as often is the case, they themselves were conquered by a new empire, an emerging empire known as the Persians. And the Persians had still a different foreign policy on how to deal with people that they conquered. Their practice was to allow the conquered people to remain in their homelands and to even practice their own faith, believing that that would keep them from rebelling and causing them to revolt. And so, under a king by the name of Cyrus of Persia and his successor Darius, the people of God were permitted to go back to Judah. And in the next 50 years, many of those exiles returned to Judah to rebuild their lives, rebuild their land, rebuild their temple even. Now, that's a lot of history, a lot of names, and sometimes, we read these Bible accounts and we wonder, how kind of accurate this stuff is. I mean, did this stuff really happen, or somebody just kind of making this stuff up? And one of the great kind of confirmations of these events is a number of archaeological finds that have been found in the last 150 years. One of them is called the Cyrus cylinder, and we got a picture of it. This is actually in the British Museum, and what this does is it just kind of verifies everything that we've already read. That Cyrus way of dealing with the foreign people that he conquered was to leave them in their land, and all of that's pointed out in that. And that's just to say, when you read the Bible, you're not reading some sacred writing where people make stuff up. It's grounded in history with real people, real names, and places, and things that really occurred. So anyway, back to the story. In 536, some 50 years after 50 years of exile, the first remnants of those people from exile end up going back to Jerusalem. And with joy, great wonder, they come back to celebrate what God has done. He's been faithful to them throughout that exile, and they come back under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the governor, and the priest by the name of Ezra. And they immediately, as soon as they get back to Jerusalem, they rebuild the altar of Israel so that they can once again offer sacrifices to God, which they did with great joy and celebration. But when they began to rebuild the actual temple around that altar that would house that altar, they began to run into some roadblocks. Some of the surrounding nations began to harass them and threaten them. And it wasn't long before these people lost heart and eventually just gave up on the project. And so work on the temple came to a standstill. And for 16 years, the house of God lay in ruin, inhabited literally by jackals and hyenas. And it is at that moment that this prophet by the name of Haggai came on the scene with a message from God for the people. And it was a rebuke. It was a in-your-face smackdown of their neglect of God's house. Verse 2, this is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. You see, the people had rationalize their neglect of God's house by convincing themselves that it just wasn't the proper time to rebuild that temple. You know, they would say, we've got all these nations around us that are hassling us. We got all these other issues as a nation trying to reform its identity and its economy and such. This just isn't the proper time, the right time to do this. We'll get to it, God. It's just not now. Today's not the right day. It's not the right time. Now, I know that none of us ever struggle with that kind of thinking, but the truth is that there are plenty of times when we end up wondering, are we doing things as we're asked to do them by God? Or do we end up finding reasons and rationales for putting things off that God has for us to do? I mean, think about maybe that new neighbor who just moved into on your block, and you've watched them come into to their home, and you can see they got a couple kids, and they're just trying to get oriented in a new area. And something inside you tugs to say, go on over there and introduce yourself and let them know you'll help them any way you can to get kind of settled and established in this new place. But then there's another voice in you that says, yeah, but I got so many other things on my plate right now. The kid's schedule is crazy. Things at work are just so up in the air. And so we say to God, well, God, I'll do that, but not just now. Maybe next month when things settle down more. Or maybe you look at the children's ministry and you can see that some of those folks that work so wonderfully with our kids, they're just running ragged at times trying to keep up with all those kids. And something inside you says, you know, you could help them a bit. But then another voice inside you says, yeah, but it's nice just to come to church and be able to get out of there and not have to worry about something in addition to what I'm already doing. Or maybe you hear there's a small group or a life group, or maybe the men's ministry that's meeting now on Wednesday nights, and you think, that's just the kind of place I need to connect with some other people. But it's just not the right time. It's crazy for me. I'm still trying to get my schoolwork finished for that degree to come and get my own house in order. It's just not the right time. Well, that's what Haggai is objecting to. That's what God is objecting to. That they keep putting this off. They find reasons to neglect God's house. Now, maybe that makes you squirm a bit, maybe not. But either way, Haggai is just getting warmed up. Verse 3, then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house, that is, my house, remains a ruin? Now, Haggai has gone from preaching to meddling, as they say. Turns out that these people weren't in great economic duress and had been attending their own homes, making improvements to their own houses in which they lived, and neglected taking care of God's house. Now, when Haggai talks about paneled houses here, he's not talking about those 1970 faux panelings that are still up in your grandparents' or your parents' basement walls, okay? He's talking more likely about hardwood, tongue and groove, finely paneled, beautifully inserted kinds of wood carvings and such in a house. And so the point he's making is that, well, you seem to have plenty of time and plenty of material and plenty of resources to fix up your own homes in fine style, and yet my own temple is in ruin. What's up here? Now, I've been around church long enough, and maybe you have too, to know that this text is a favorite for preachers in the middle of a building campaign. Brethren, shall we recline in our wood-paneled family rooms while our poor children are having Sunday school in the moldy church basement? But that's really not the thrust of what Haggai wants to talk about. He is primarily here wanting to confront a sin, something wrong with us, something that we would call materialism. Now, remember that this temple represents for these people the presence of God among them. For hundreds of years, this temple had been a sign and a symbol that God was present and he was active in each of their lives and in their lives as a nation. It was at the temple that people gathered to worship and to find forgiveness. It was at the temple that they gave thanks to the Lord and they sought his deliverance and healing. It was at the temple that they celebrated the great events of their nation's history and victories. It was at the temple that they were reminded again of their identity as God's people and the community that God had formed them into. And so in the better days, the Judeans had given their first and their very best to God's house and God's activities among them. But now, having begun with great intentionality for the past 16 years, they have been so preoccupied with their own pursuits, with their own homes, with their own things, that they are neglecting the house and things of God. And if that's not hitting home yet, Haggai makes it even more clear in the next verse. Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. Notice Haggai identifies three material necessities of life. Food, he talks about drink, he talks about clothing. These are the things we need each day, as did the people of Haggai's day. And if you add in shelter that he's already talked about, he's describing the material things that we spend most of our time worrying about and working toward. Things we work hard to provide for ourselves, things that we work hard to provide for our family. A roof over our head, food on the table, clothes on our back. These are the essentials of life. And so Haggai is not rebuking them for pursuing these things. He's simply pointing out that no matter how hard they pursue them, no matter how many of these things they end up acquiring, they never seem to have enough. There's always something more they think they need. Now, the consensus of historians and scholars that have done a lot of work on this chapter of Israel's history is that this time in Israel's history was not a particularly harsh time economically. They weren't experiencing any prolonged droughts or famines. They weren't at war with an outside nation so that they had to direct all the nation's resources to something else. It was just a normal, frankly, economically okay time. And yet no matter what they got, they never seemed to have enough. They never achieved the satisfaction. They never found the meaning and the purpose and the joy and the security that they were looking for when they tried to get more and more of that stuff. Now, I think we probably know a bit about that as Americans. We're told that Americans today own twice as many cars as they did 40 years ago and eat out twice as often as 40 years ago. And yet when people are surveyed for how happy they are, how content they are, there's no difference between 1970s and today. Because we continue to believe that what we need is something more, and then we'll be more happy. If only I had a nicer car. If only I lived in a slightly nicer neighborhood, then I would be happy. Then I would find security. Then I would find a sense of peace. And that's the lie, frankly, that the people of Haggai's day have fallen for as well. Now, they didn't have the kind of disposable income. They didn't have the multitude of choices we have today. But their approach to life and the results they were trying to experience were the very same as we do. It never seemed, no matter how much they had, to be enough for them. And that's the problem with materialism. And that's, by the way, the first blank. The problem with materialism is we never seem to have enough. So, what's the problem exactly? Certainly there's nothing wrong with having food on the table, having a shirt on your back or a roof over your head, even a flat screen TV on the wall. There's nothing wrong with those things. So what's wrong with what they were thinking and where they were going with it? Well, it turns out it's not a problem of pursuing these things. It's a problem of prioritizing things. The problem we have is not the pursuit. The problem is the priority. We put material pursuits ahead of spiritual pursuits. And that's what Haggai speaks about, and beginning with verse 7. Look, so this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. See, the problem was that the people had put material pursuits ahead of their spiritual pursuits. See, remember again that the temple isn't just a building, isn't just a religious kind of edifice. The temple represents God's very presence among them. And so when the people neglected that temple, they weren't just failing to pursue religious ceremonies or obligations. They were neglecting God himself. So by their actions and by their priorities, they were saying, it is more important to me that I live in a comfortable house than I live in a God-centered house. It is more important to me that I have panels on my wall than I have the presence of God in my home. They had become materialists. We could define materialism this way: the tendency to consider material possessions, physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. And so the problem wasn't that they were pursuing things. The problem was that they had the wrong priorities. And so that's the second blank. The problem is not a matter of pursuit. It's a matter of priorities. Now, if I did a survey this morning, it's doubtful I would get anyone to stand up and self-identify themselves as a materialist. But the truth is, our actions suggest often otherwise. We think and we act as if acquiring more things, achieving more earthly success will somehow make us happy and feel important and give us the security and the sense of safety and identity that we think we need. And so we give priority to earthly material pursuits rather than spiritual kingdom pursuits. And that's why Haggai says in verse 7 at the end, give careful thought to your ways. See, this stuff can just creep up on you, and you hardly know you've gotten caught in it all. And the truth is, some things that are wrong about our lives, we know they're wrong the moment that we participate in them. But some things sometimes feel fine. So let's just ask a few diagnostic questions this morning to discern the level to which we have bought into this sin called materialism. I'd advise you not to answer these questions out loud, by the way. Here's question 1. When church competes with sports, who wins? When time in the Bible competes with time on social media, which gets the lion's share? When giving money away competes with spending money on ourselves, what tends to happen? When serving on the weekend competes with keeping our weekends free, which do we tend to choose? Now, again, there is nothing wrong with sports and Facebook and going away for the weekend. It's just that when those things become more important, when they take precedence over the spiritual dimensions of life, we become materialists. We look to the things and earth to satisfy the deepest longings of our heart. And things, stuff, can never finally fill that empty spot in our heart. See, the problem with materialism is that it just never finally satisfies us. No matter how much you get, it's never enough. That's what Haggai is telling these people. They keep trying and they never are filled. And that's the problem with it. The other problem with materialism is that it never lasts. Every material thing eventually breaks or rusts or fades or becomes obsolete or goes out of fashion. The things of God last. Haggai says, you expected much, verse 9, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. So this is what I believe Haggai is telling the people and telling us. When we neglect the things of God, the things of this world are never enough. If you don't remember anything else today, try to remember this. When we neglect the things of God, the things of this world are never enough. We think they'll make us happy, but they won't give us that security, that joy, that purpose in life that we so long for. David Meyer, a psychologist, recently wrote a book called The American Paradox, Spiritual Hunger in an Age of Plenty. David Meyer is a wonderful author, spent thousands of hours in researching and interviewing people and discovered that people who pursue wealth and material possessions as a focus in their life tend to feel less satisfied with life and tend to experience far fewer positive moments in any given day than people who don't have that as the focus. In fact, the very opposite he found is true, that the people who report the highest level of life satisfaction tend to value material things far less than the average person. That's why talk to some of the people around here that are really pursuing spiritual values, who are giving their lives away. The people that I know in this church with the greatest joy are the people that are building their lives into other people. The people that are serving on Colfax and Kairos and doing kinds of ministries where they're not focused on their own needs. They're focused on helping other people's needs. They're pursuing and they're ending up giving themselves to other people. Because when we neglect the things of God, the things of this world are never enough. Or, I guess we could frame it more positively this way. When we prioritize the things of God, everything else falls into its proper place. When we prioritize the things of God, everything else falls into its proper place. So Haggai, again, is not saying that food and drink and shelter are not important. He's simply saying they're not as important as experiencing the power and the presence of God in our lives. Now, if you don't want to take Haggai's words for it, we'll give you the words of another prophet, a guy by the name of Jesus, who, after talking to a crowd, telling them not to worry about what they would eat or what they would wear, said, "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." That's worth pointing out. He was talking to a bunch of working class folks. They didn't live in paneled houses, but he was promising them contentment. He was promising them purpose and fulfillment and joy in life when they made the spiritual pursuits of life the thing that they focused their lives on. So, what does that really look like? I mean, in terms of actual kind of living out things. I mean, I can stop right here and we can all go home and feel bad about, the fact that we haven't done what we think we're supposed to do. Or we can actually take a look at maybe some actual practical ways that we can put God first. So I want to suggest 4 ways we can put God first. And the first way is give God the first day of the week. In other words, make weekend worship, make weekend fellowship, make weekend ministry here at the church a non-negotiable for you and your family. Now, again, if you know me, I'm not talking about this in a legalistic kind of a way. I'm not saying check that off the box of your life, or that somehow you're going to earn brownie points by being here 4 out of 4 weekends. As soon as we start thinking that way about church attendance, we miss the point entirely. The point is that we prioritize time with God and time with his people, and that coming to worship on the weekends is putting first what belongs first, putting first what probably over the course of the week got shoved down to 2nd or 4th or 10th place in all the busyness of your life. Putting God first and centering your life and your time around him and his word and his mission is one way you put him first. Now, I know our schedules, I know how crazy they get. I know how difficult it is to get here on Sunday morning, particularly when you've got kids in tow at times. I know the challenge of all that. That is one of the main reasons, it is the main reason, we offer multiple services at different times so that we can make worship more accessible to you. So if you're tied up on Sunday morning, you can come on Saturday night. Or if later Sunday morning won't work because you've got other plans, you can come to the earlier services. But the multiple services give us a chance to encourage you to figure out a way that will work for you. So that's the first thing. Give God the first day of the week. So if you're not sick and you're in town, make it a priority to get to one of the services. It will change how you look at the rest of your life and your week along the way. Second way we can put God first is by giving him the first percentage of our income. Now, we just finished a capital stewardship campaign this past fall. I'm not going to go into all the things I think we learned there, but one of the things we did learn was that the Bible teaches proportionate giving. So we don't measure our giving by how much we put in the plate. We measure our giving by the percentage we put in the plate. And the Bible speaks of a benchmark of 10%. Now, again, that's not a requirement, and it's not a limit. It's a benchmark. The point is whether you give 5% or 10% or 20%, that you give that first, not the leftovers at the end of the month when all the other things are covered, but first so that you can give God the chance to show that he will provide for you when you honor him in that way. And so that's the second way. A third way we can put God first is to give him first attention in our daily activities. Now, for many of us, that means before we start the busyness of the day and start checking off all the things we have to do, we stop at the very beginning of the day to sit down with a Bible in hand. And for 10 or 20 minutes, just have quiet time of listening to him as he speaks to us from his word, and as we can pray about the things that we have on our plate for the day. Or maybe it works better for you at the end of the day. You've gotten the kids to bed finally, and you have all of 20 minutes of quiet to yourself. Use that time. And there's other ways we can put God first in the course of a day. Simply put him before everything else you do. So pray before you eat. Pray before you pick up that phone to make that difficult call. Pray before you begin that challenging task at work. Pray before you hop into the car for that trip. Pray before you turn in for the night. You put him first when you make time for him at the beginning of all the activities of your day. And then finally, a fourth way to put him first is to give him first place in your parenting. Parents, I'll just ask you this straight out. Are you as attentive to your child's spiritual development as you are to your child's academic development or athletic development or musical development or cultural development? Do you work as hard to make sure they have every opportunity to flourish spiritually as you do to make sure they can flourish academically or athletically? And do you talk freely and openly and often about spiritual issues and matters in your home, just as you talk about other things in your home? Again, it's not that those other things are not important. It's just that they're not as important as that spiritual development. When the time comes for that child of yours to be sent off into the world to do life on their own, let me tell you something. You're not going to be nearly so concerned about what grades they made in school, or how many sports awards they won, or how many languages they can speak, or even what school they're going to be going to next. The thing you're going to be most concerned about, wherever they go, is that they go there with God. Is that they enter their future, whatever it looks like, with God at their side. Now, there's no way to guarantee that, but it will certainly not happen unless you prioritize it, unless you intentionalize it. And so those are some of the practical suggestions for making spiritual pursuits the priority in your life, because when we prioritize the things of God, the other things tend to fall into their proper place. And that was the message that Haggai had for these people of Judah so long ago. And the amazing thing about it all was that the people, for once, listened to this prophet. They actually took seriously his words, and they actually did what the preacher said. Verse 12. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the word of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message to the people, of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. And within 4 weeks' time, after he gave this sermon, that's now this book, they began rebuilding that temple. And chapter 2 goes on to describe how the people went to and made that a task, and how the Lord strengthened them and met them and blessed them, even though they ended up facing difficulties along the way. And then they actually fulfilled that requirement to get that temple built. Now, as wonderful as it was, that they finally now had their priorities back in order, and as wonderful as it was to be able to step back and see that that house of God was now built again, Haggai points to an even greater day and an even greater house. Skip down to chapter 2, where we read these words made famous by a stirring recitative in Handel's Messiah, verse 6. So this is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all the nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty, and in this place I will grant peace. Now, the ultimate shaking that Haggai was speaking about was, in fact, the coming of his son into the world to live, to die, to be raised again for us. And the house he was referring to was Christ's body, the church, this house of which we are a part, and the house in which he grants peace to anyone who is willing to enter. And this peace and this glory that he speaks about can be ours today. The peace of knowing that God is with us no matter what goes on in our lives, and the glory of knowing that we are used by God to build this house and to grant peace, to help people everywhere and anywhere to discover life with God. And what could be more important and more satisfying and more fulfilling than to join God in that great mission along the way? But that's all possible because there's another sacrifice that was made by Jesus himself. And it wasn't a sacrifice that was done on an altar of a temple in Jerusalem. It was a sacrifice that was made on a cross outside the walls of that holy city. And it was a sacrifice that Jesus invites us to remember each time we celebrate this meal we call the Lord's Supper. And that's what we're going to close with today. See, the truth is, the presence of God today is to be found among his people. And the elements of communion are the concrete expressions of his presence. He said, "This is my body, this is my blood." And that reminds us that he is present with us. Each time we celebrate this, and each time we come to worship. And so we're going to invite you to just stay where you are as we distribute these elements and have a chance to be in the presence of God and to, in concrete ways, be reminded again of his work among us. On the night in which he was betrayed, he took a piece of bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took a cup and said, "This cup is a new promise I make to all of you. Drink it as often as you do, remembering me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Come, allow the presence of God to be among us today.